feelings about it. I think people see technology and they fall in love with it, but they don't really understand what it's actually giving them.
Yep.
So an example would be, people are concerned about making sure that we hit certain velocity thresholds when it comes to, doing near a 5 RM or something like that in a squat. The fact of the matter is I don't care what the velocity is. I want to move the weight.
Right.
And the other thing with it is if they're weak, we shouldn't be using them. We shouldn't be using that technology anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Brian will also be the first person to tell you that, is that not to say you're wasting your time, but you're essentially wasting your time by giving the athlete a tool that they're not ready to use.
Yeah. And, some of these episodes so far, I've just, trying to hammer away locally first. I'd love to get Dr. Fry on here and talk hormonal and all that stuff, but he's got some PhD students. What's his name? Johnny Miller. I had Johnny Miller on here, and basically what he said over the course of an hour and a half, more or less, was, intent is what matters. On every single rep, you should be trying to move the weight as fast as possible. And that's one of the things that we hammer home with our athletes all the time is intention, intention, intention. And more of the research I'm seeing is basically supporting that position.
Training is not that hard. It's really, I think people because they want to be the next big name at something.
Yep.
They're just like, I'm doing this because this is what I believe. And it's like, well, yeah, that's great, but now you've lost all the foundations of your actual training program. Mm-hmm. We can accomplish a hell of a lot by squatting, pressing, and pulling.
Yep.
I'll never say that, trust me, no one's a bigger fan of squatting than me. Mm-hmm. I love doing weightlifting movements with my athletes as well. But the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of ways to accomplish the exact same thing.
Exactly. So,
yeah, I don't think with any of my athletes here I've ever prescribed sets of 12 for anything. I've done sets of 10, but it's there for about 3 or 4 weeks, depending on where we're at in the season, and then we don't touch them for a really long time.
Yeah. So I was listening to Travis Mash's podcast the other day, and the one where you were featured on there. And I'm not sure, have you been on there more than once?
No, it was just that one time. That was a fun experience with Travis. I don't really know Travis all that well, but just because a lot of the stuff that I do is weightlifting related, and it was nice to be able to talk about some things related to not just weightlifting, but training in general, just because I think he has a unique take on it because he weightlifters, not exclusively, because Travis is a variety or works with a variety of athletes, but it's always nice to hear and talk shop with someone who gets it.
Right. And, especially I think it's interesting to listen to him because he comes from, obviously it seems like, I know he said he's done weightlifting, but then he did some powerlifting for quite a while using West Side methodology and things like that. So I like listening to him, whoever he has on. But I think in there you were talking about you were working with volleyball primarily at the time. Is that still the case? Are you working with every sports team now, or what's?
More and more. From a strength and conditioning standpoint, I write the program for the volleyball team and implement it with them here. However, I spearhead all the assessment of the teams here as well. So at various times, we'll assess the men's and women's soccer, women's basketball, men's basketball, some track and field athletes. And then we also do kind of every end of semester, we do a testing combine where pretty much any of the teams can come and test. So, we'll get softball, baseball from time to time, lacrosse, most of our sports. There's really only a handful of the teams that we haven't done anything with, but we're doing more and more. So the main teams that we really don't see right now are our tennis teams and We do strength and conditioning with golf, but we really don't assess much with them.
So what's your current assessment process look like?
We have a battery of tests that we like to have everyone run through. Right now, I know for volleyball, it probably does more testing than anybody. We actually test them weekly in terms of their counter movement jumps, and we use that to monitor performance. So we'll look at things like relative power. We'll look at time to take off, RSI mod, things like that, just to kind of have a measure. I don't want to say neural fatigue because we're not actually assessing that. We're just looking at performance changes. But so the testing battery that they do, so we always measure height and weight. We have some athletes that can grow when they're obviously here. So body mass changes, we do a 7-site skin fold or a BIA depending on the team in terms of size. Like for example, women's and men's soccer is probably about 40 people. So it's difficult to obviously go through and do skin folds on that many people. So yeah, we do a 7-site skin fold, and then we do a warm up, and then we come in and do jump testing in the lab. So we have two sets of Pasco force plates and another Burtec force plate in the ground. So really we have 3 testing stations. But once we have all the software and everything up running, testing will go so much faster because, once we are able to set up all the stations, it's just like, hey, bam, 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 hammer them out. But they do unloaded and loaded squat jumps and counter movement jumps. Okay. And the loaded jumps, if we were being really specific and using it for research purposes, we would have them jump with a percentage of their body mass. But for this, we standardize it and everyone jumps with a 20-kilo bar.
Okay.
So, and then after that, depending on the team, we have some more specific testing. So what I just told you is kind of our standard testing battery. Some teams don't do squat jumps. They just do counter movement jumps, which is fine. But then like volleyball, we do some conditioning testing. One we call the gauntlet, where it's back row specific. And then we use another one from Jeremy Shepard, which is a volleyball specific test or a conditioning test. And so in addition to that, like for men's and women's soccer, we do an arrowhead agility test, and we do a 20-yard sprint with a 10-yard split.
Okay.
Just to make it a bit more specific. But then a lot of the teams, including lacrosse, some of the basketball actually, and the soccer teams, obviously, we do the yo-yo.
What's a yo-yo?
It's a conditioning test. So it's similar to a pacer, but the way that it works is you actually have a 10-second recovery standard in between each interval. So it ends up being repeat sprints with one change of direction at the end of it.
Okay, gotcha.
So I can't remember exactly the distance off the top of my head, but it's probably 25 yards or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but it can't be that far. Anyway, not big. But yeah, they run down, they touch the line, and they run back, and this is all sequenced to beeps, and then we have 10-second recovery, and then they're doing it again. So obviously a bit more specific to those intermittent sports like soccer, basketball, and lacrosse, just because they have intermittent sprints.
Right.
So yeah. We try to do a little specific testing for every team just to make sure that they're getting what they want to get.
And we've got one of those just jump mats, and the kids, like, we primarily work with, the youngest kid. We've got a kid in there deadlifting right now who's 11 years old, and then we'll have some college athletes who are home for the summer. So there's a wide range, and basically we're just trying to get kids a solid foundation for training. So we don't do anything fancy. It's literally every program has some sort of, explosive movement of some kind, whether it's a jump, a throw, an Olympic lift variation. And then they'll have their core lift and then their accessory circuits. But anyway, we'll have that just jump mat out, and kids freaking love that thing. So it's one way for us to kind of look at, okay, each day, if a kid comes in and says they're not feeling it, or, you've been around athletes and you can just tell like they don't have it today, or they just don't look snappy, then we can basically adjust their volume for the day. But the only other thing we really use to kind of measure, and I'm definitely open to suggestions if you have any recommendations, but I have them do that tap test that's on the phone, where they'll just tap their finger every morning when they wake up, run it 3 times. And, I'm sure there's better things out there, but that at least gives us some idea for preparedness. And then another thing I encourage our athletes to do is, use a heart rate monitor to somehow record your heart rate, either when you're waking up or going to bed, just so there's some constant. And then we can see like, okay, if there's any significant change in these numbers, we know you're probably not that ready to lift heavy, even if we have that scheduled, or to test you or to whatever. So, and then that just jump mat is a third thing that's a good indicator. Is I think they should be able to hit like 80% of their best on any given day. But, if they're not, those are different ways we'll kind of check out if they're ready or not. But,
yeah, I mean, the just jump mat, I know, I don't know if you know Daniel Cant-Hull. He's at Marquette.
Oh, yeah, I remember him.
Yeah. He works with, he's one of the assistant strength and conditioning coaches there. He used to do a lot of jump mat stuff. He used jump height as well. Jump height to me is kind of a finicky measurement, because I personally it's not to say that it's not important. I personally would rather understand how they are achieving that jump height rather than what the jump height is, because the jump height to me is just an absolute measure. But I want to know, did they spend a lot of time on the ground? Did they spend a little time on the ground? So I usually look at that time to take off as a metric. And, which is why a lot of people have gravitated toward things like reactive strength index or modified reactive strength index. Some people use Dave Hamilton at Penn State when he was with USA Field Hockey. He was with Field Hockey. He would actually have them do like a 12-inch drop jump. Okay. And he still do it at Penn State, but he does that to look at RSI as a measurement of readiness, because obviously the longer the ground contact time is, the more kind of neural processing time that it takes.
Okay. So that'll kind of point you in the right direction of what that athlete needs to work on. So that RSI, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, what's that graded on?
So reactive strength index is the original metric, and that has to do with a drop jump. And the drop and what RSI, the calculation is jump height to ground contact time. So it's a ratio. Okay. And in addition to that, modified reactive strength index, which was from Eben 2010, I think was the first time that they used it. They substituted ground contact time for time to take off. So time to take off is calculated from the onset of the unweighting phase, or when someone first starts to dip during the movement, to when they leave the ground. Okay. So, and then we look at that as a ratio compared to how high they jumped. So in theory, if someone spends more time on the ground, they should theoretically be able to jump higher. But when they're fatigued, it doesn't work that way.
Okay.
Because when you spend more time on the ground, you're creating a larger impulse, which should, like I said, allow you to jump higher. But it's a unique measurement because it takes into the strategy of how someone jumps. You get like a basketball or track and field sprinter, they just bounce off their 10. Yeah. So they don't do a deep deep counter movement by any means. So they're able to be very quick off the ground, and some of them can just sky.
Yeah.
But others who try to adopt that strategy can't jump high at all.
Yeah.
But we had some volleyball players at East Tennessee State that would do a full squat when they would do their counter movement, and they jump through the roof. So it's just how people are built. It's all unique.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Cause we've definitely got one of those kids that, there's going to be his freshman year at college. I think in Lamar out in Colorado. And, but he's definitely exactly what you're talking about in terms of springiness. I mean, he'll come in completely cold, see somebody messing around on that just jump mat, and he'll jump 33 to 35 inches on every day. I mean, it's bizarre. But so the full squat works better for some athletes. So it's just a way they're basically put together, more or less.
Yeah, I mean, some people can handle those that mechanical disadvantage that you end up being in that deeper position. Some people can't.
Right.
It all comes back to stiffness qualities in the muscles, but also their eccentric strength. Because if they can't hold on to that dip that they go down and do, then it's going to be pretty bad when they try to come out of it.
Right. So getting into some of your weightlifting derivative research, I think I sent you like a DM or an email or something asking you about what percentage we should use for a mid-thigh, like clean pull or something. That's a big one with our athletes is, we obviously want to teach them the proper way to clean and snatch because, who knows what they're looking like at high school level when they're in their weights class or the teachers are making them do these lifts. We at least want to make sure they're competent. But I really do like all those clean pull and snatch pull variations and derivatives because now we can overload. We don't have to worry or risk, like a collarbone or a wrist or a finger, whatever. And we still get the benefits. So what are you finding right now? What are you looking at? Are you looking at more snatch variations, clean variations?
A lot of what we've done up to this point has all been clean variations. The original papers, I think, were 2011. It was Paul Comfort out of the Salford University of Salford. But it's primarily stayed with clean variations because what we've found is that a lot more people do cleans and power cleans compared to snatches. Now, for better for worse, obviously, but if you can snatch and you can hang power snatch, etc., that's obviously more variations for you to use. But yeah, for the most part, it's just been clean variation research. There's been one study, I think, one study. It was a master's thesis out of App State that I was one co-advisor on that basically repeated one of my thesis papers. And it ended up finding essentially the same results. So whether it was clean or snatch, you end up seeing with a jump shrug and a high pull that they end up producing very similar magnitudes compared to the hang power snatch. But what was interesting is because the snatch has a larger displacement over a short period of time,
right,
velocity starts to catch up to things like a jump shrug. And so the jump shrug produced the highest power output at lighter loads. Not surprising. It's thick, you can jump high. But at higher loads, it ended up being, I believe, not statistically different from the jump shrug. And actually it ended up being the highest on average, but from a practical standpoint, really not different. But it was kind of unique with those two. In terms of the high pull ended up falling into that third position in terms of ranking. But it's also if you've ever done a high pull with a snatch grip, it's different. It's different compared to doing a high pull with a clean grip. But yeah, most of our research on clean variations right now, we're in the middle of doing a 10-week training study. Training studies last forever. This is probably the third fall in a row that we've been running this study just because we can't seem to get enough participants when we need to. Which is why I always give Paul Comfort some grief in the UK, because you can get rugby players to do anything. And we just don't have as many of them.
Right.
You know, what we're comparing is the first training study that was done in Paul Comfort's lab, and I was part of that project. And what they compared was the 8 weeks of training in season with clean catch variations versus pull variations. And what we ended up finding is that there was no statistical or practically meaningful difference between either variation. The take-home message essentially is you can get very similar benefits, whether it's squat jumps, counter movement jumps, iso pull strength, and I can't remember if he did a 1RM or not, but the benefits ended up being essentially the same. So the take home is you can use either to train. It's not one or the other, it's you can use either to train.
Right.
Common misconception is that a lot of our research says acutely that there is perhaps superior effects with pulling variations, but longitudinally people turn that into, well, then we don't have to catch anymore. That's what we said.
Right.
That's not what we're saying. And we've never said that in any of our research projects. It's always been this acutely shows this. We should incorporate these into our training program, because the second research project tried to build on top of that, the one that we're running right now, where we are doing 10 weeks of training. We have 3 groups. The first 2 groups are very similar to what Paul Comfort did. They had it's catch variations and pull variations, but they are using the exact same loads. So if I load a power clean from the floor with 80% of 1RM, then do I pull from the floor with 80% of 1RM? So just to make it biomechanically similar. But what we did is we added a third group. Obviously, the pulling variations give you some unique things that you can do from a force velocity standpoint.
Right.
Add more weight as an overload, so we can use greater loads than 100% of our 1RM. But we can also use exercises that are more ballistic in nature, such as a jump shrug or a high pull. So what we did is we used biomechanically similar movements, but we overloaded them from both a force and velocity standpoint at different times of the training program. So an example is that the first block of training is, or I should say, one of our blocks of training is a strength block. So 3 sets of 5. The catch group is doing power cleans from the floor and mid-thigh power cleans. The pull group uses the exact same loads and does pull from the floor, with the exact same loads, and mid-thigh pull with the exact same loads. An extremely light mid-thigh pull, I will add, when you use that light load. But with this overload, what we ended up doing is the pulls from the floor had an additional 20% of their 1RM added on top of it. Why? Because they're capable of doing that. So instead of 80%, they may be doing 100% of their 1RM for 5 repetitions. In addition to that, we pretty much went no holds barred with the mid-thigh pull and ended up bringing them up to about 135% of their 1RM. So, but given how small the displacement is, do that. Versus when we got to more of a power phase or like speed strength here at the very end of the program, we ended up loading them with jump shrugs down at 30%. So really what it does is that we can train both aspects of the force velocity curve to a greater extent with our pulling variations, but we still see improvements with some catching variations as well.
Right.
Again, it's not one or the other. It's use them at certain times of the training program that you can get the benefits that you're looking for. So what we're seeing with these results currently is we are seeing greater benefits from a 1RM power clean standpoint. Keep in mind that these individuals who go through this training program from a pull standpoint don't catch for 10 weeks. So they do their baseline testing and do a 1RM power clean from the floor. They don't catch for 10 weeks, and then afterwards we bring them back and they do a 1RM again. Interestingly enough, we've actually had some of the overload group improve their 1RM power clean by about 15%.
Then they do catch on the post.
Correct. So we've had some people that were, from a relative standpoint, were already pretty strong.
Right.
Went from 1.4 times their body mass to 1.55.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, something's working. So we look at this, and so obviously everything is going to be based on percent change and relative if we can. So we see greater improvements from both a 1RM standpoint, or I should say from a 1RM standpoint, from an iso pull force production standpoint. We also are measuring sprints, a 505 change of direction, counter movement jumps, squat jumps, and we are looking at ultrasound of 2 different muscles.
Oh, okay.
I'm dreading analyzing the ultrasound because it's just a lot of pictures and a lot of time.
So you're going to be on a lot of screen time on that one.
That might be a grad student project.
Yeah. Here you go. You guys, if you want to help me out. So that brings up another couple things I wanted to ask you about. So I think I know the difference here, but if you could elaborate a little bit on, I think people butcher the terms all the time when they say strength speed or speed strength. And
Sure.
there is a distinction. Can you elaborate on what the differences are, please?
Sure. Yeah. Strength speed is what we kind of define as moving heavy loads quickly. An example would be a weightlifting derivative such as the mid-thigh pull. We use really heavy loads in excess of a 1RM power clean, for example. We're still having the max intent to move that as fast as possible. And in contrast, an exercise that's more speed strength oriented is moving light loads quickly. So in that regard, we're maybe thinking you can use any ballistic exercise in that regard. So whether it's a hex bar jump, a jump shrug with light loads, a jump squat, that's more of a speed strength type exercise.
Okay. And then the second thing I wanted to ask about was, with some of our athletes who have been with us for a few years, I feel like they've kind of earned the right to do more complex exercises and advanced techniques. Now, for the majority of the athletes, hopefully they'll be with us for all 4 years of high school and, be ready to go into a college program, well-developed and well-rounded. But one of the things I've been kind of playing with a few athletes has been the iso pulls. Mm-hmm. And if I remember right, I think I've seen some of your lab doing some research where you're pulling against, call it an empty bar, and you're just pulling it from a mid-thigh or an above knee or power position. And I've just been playing around with like 3 sets of 5-second strains, which is a hell of a long time, but just seeing if that potentiates any new PRs for these athletes when they're going into a max out session. So what have you found with those iso pulls in terms of, hormonal response? Like, do you do anything with hormones at all?
I don't have the capacity to do that. I wish I had the capacity to do it with kind of like Andy Fry's lab. They do a lot of great stuff there. You're probably right down the road.
I want to get him on here so bad just to talk about like what hormonal changes do we see. But
yeah. The in terms of the iso pull stuff, a lot of it we use for more assessment rather than actual training. Okay. However, there is some I think there's one, maybe two projects that have used that as a potentiation stimulus to kind of enhance subsequent performance.
Right.
And I think it was actually Doc Stone.
Yeah, figures.
Yeah, figures, right? They used isometric mid-thigh pulls to improve mid-thigh pull performance. So they were using it as a training tool in which they were trying to enhance the subsequent repetitions.
Gotcha.
So it wasn't, so it was an isometric pull followed by dynamic mid-thigh pulls. And I think that might be the only project that's really used it for potentiation purposes. But you would think from a neural standpoint that you can relate a lot of those high-end motor units in that power position.
Right.
So, and, you know, I think more research with that as a mechanism needs to be done. However, it's kind of what do you look at, because I think it can be beneficial for people like weightlifters. I just don't know how position specific it's going to be for other people.
Right. Because that's something else I've seen people go back and forth on. Anytime you're doing isometric work, you know, it's only going to work to what degree? Like, is it only going to be within 10 degrees of that ISO position, or is it greater than that, less than that? I mean, is that anything you've looked at?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, because the other thing with ISO pulls and even ISO squats is you may start in that initial position, but there may be, George Beckham has looked at some of this stuff, is how much the angles actually change when you initiate the movement. You know, there's going to be those people that they start in that position and that's the position they stay in.
Yeah.
There's going to be others that during the actual pull itself, you may increase an angle at the knee by 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees maybe. You don't want them to do that, but it ends up being slightly dynamic in terms of the participant actually completing it.
Like, how should someone go about measuring volume with these derivatives? And then like a follow-up to that is, how do you manage fatigue, or how should coaches manage fatigue in the weight room?
Well, the first one's a big question. How do you measure volume with derivatives? Well, we still stick with the standard sets and reps with it. Obviously, we don't have, you can track displacement with the bar if you really want to. Now, the fact of the matter is the volume with if you talk about volume load displacement, it's probably going to be greater during catching variations than it is pulling variations, just because the bar has to move a lot farther and they have to bring it down a farther distance. So that's something to take into consideration. For pulling variations, it's kind of unique. If you're looking at volume load displacement, if you're looking at force dominant exercises like mid-thigh pull, pull from the floor, etc., you could end up having a really small displacement, but you may also be using really heavy loads that may come close to the volume load displacement when you end up doing the entire calculations. The one thing people forget, however, is that following the pull, you still have to absorb the load. So a lot of people, when they do pulls sometimes, is they'll pull it and then they'll let go and just let it fall to the ground. Problem with that is you're only completing half the lift, in my opinion. Pull from the floor, to me, is you pull it and then you bring that bar back into that power position and then bring it down to the floor again. Versus just letting it fall and then resetting. Now, the only exception to these exercises is when you're using something like a mid-thigh pull that's in the rack, or a pull from the knee in the rack. The loads may be heavy enough that you don't necessarily want to absorb those. It's not, I mean, theoretically, you could do, Paul Comfort looked at 140% of 1RM for mid-thigh pulls. You could do that dynamically outside of the rack, It's not easy though. It's,
Yeah.
you know, some people are able to do it really easily. Some people aren't. You know, a lot of people, you're actually training slightly different qualities when you do it from the rack versus outside. When you do it from a rack, you start from a dead stop position and you have to generate the force to get the bar moving.
Mm-hmm.
Versus when you're outside of the rack, you've already generated some force because you're standing up with it. But now from a dynamic standpoint, you have to start from a dead stop.
Right.
So I know I've strayed off topic already.
No,
I could
you're good. You're good.
But in order to measure the actual volume of those exercises, we still stick with sets and reps for now.
Okay.
One of the things, project that I alluded to that we're moving towards with velocity-based training is we'll be able to track the velocity of the bar, number one, but we'll also be able to figure out how far the bar travels during a pull, during the absorption phase. But what we're trying to end up getting to is trying to match what those demands are in relation to catching variations. So what I mean by that is how can we effectively prescribe loads using velocity bands essentially and see how they match catching variations.
Okay.
Basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to find a better way of prescribing pulling variations without doing a 1RM for a catching variation.
Right.
Because right now they're all programmed off of a 1RM hang power clean or power clean.
And there's going to be some degree of skill catching that. So that's the other thing too, is, you know, I hear coach, and it just makes me cringe when I hear coaches say, well, I don't have the time to teach an athlete to catch or whatever. It's like, well, it depends on how long you have that athlete for. If you have them for 4 years. It
also depends on how good of a coach you are.
Right. That's true.
Because you could have people that say, God, this takes, you know, 4, 5, 6 weeks to do. And it's like, does it?
Yep.
Because if you have a good coach, you can knock that out fairly quickly.
Yeah. Like I was watching, you know, what's his name? John Coffey. John Coffey teach someone how to snatch in a matter of minutes, you know, because he's like decent. Because he's, you know, been coaching for 40, 50 years. And to watch someone like a master like that is just poetry, you know?
Oh, it's, yeah.
Then the other question I had for you was about, so what do you do with fatigue management? I mean, like, do you use some of these assessment tools and say, okay, these athletes need to back down or these athletes need to do more? What do you do there?
Yeah, so we do several things. When I do weekly testing with our volleyball team here, there's several metrics that I continue to look at on a weekly basis, and I have the relationship with our volleyball coach that she trusts me to essentially tell her who's fresh, who's not. So it's all about developing some individualized thresholds. A lot of the times it ends up being close to about a 5 or 10% decrement. 10% is probably an extreme, but some people are so sensitive that you almost have to expand that out a little bit in terms of what their threshold is. So example, if we use a 5% threshold, if I'm tracking them weekly, if they decrease a certain amount or beyond that 5% threshold, then I go back to the coach and say, you know, Susie's tired. So we need to back off and practice a little bit. You know, and what the coach has done in the past is she has allowed them to go through maybe like 2/3 of the practice. And again, this is all hypothetical.
Sure.
2/3 of the practice, but then they back off on some of the drills that they may be doing full board normally. But a lot of what I look for is trends. So if I have someone who's trending downward, you know, 1 week, I'm not that concerned because they very well could just bounce back next week and be just fine.
Right.
2 weeks, obviously more concerned. 3 weeks, we're doing something wrong.
Right.
So this individual is not responding to the training that we're doing, or is just overloaded. And the other thing I have to look at in addition to that with the athletes is what time of the year are we in? When, for example, when we get to conference season, all of those matches take a larger toll, mentally, but also physically, because they're so important.
Right.
So I look at the metrics, I look at jump height, I look at relative peak power, I look at reactive strength index, I even look at mean force asymmetry to see how we're jumping on and off the plate. So I take all those numbers, I look at the trends, and whether it's a quick text message or a sit down with the coach, I'd be like, A, B, and C, these athletes are fine, they're good to go. D, E, and F, we got to back off a little bit.
Right.
Usually she's pretty receptive to it. Obviously, the coach is going to play who they're going to play. Mm-hmm. Thing that we can do is inform.
Right.
So I use that, but in addition to just to make sure that we're getting some benefit to recovery, we've used various recovery modalities in the past. The common one that we've been using is some light stretching and some foam rolling, key areas of the body. In the past, we've also had athletes in the pool just to get them unweighted a little bit.
Yep.
And it's just really light work, whether it's jogging or whether it's just light swimming. We just like to get them some work doing that. Obviously, there's a slew of other recovery modalities, but those are probably two that I promote more than anything else, because it says a lot when you can take them through like a standardized foam rolling program, just so they get those naggy knots out, and and some light stretching with it. Should be we're usually good to go with that.
Right. And
we've used that with volleyball. We use that with our soccer teams as well.
Okay. Because that's something we're constantly trying to educate just our local community, specifically the coaches and the parents and the athletes, about, it's okay to lift in season. In fact, you should. It's obviously we're not going to do hypertrophy work in season, but getting people over that, myth that's out there of like, don't lift in season or whatever. And then the other thing that we're trying to communicate, fortunately, we have great relationships with our athletic trainers that are at both local high schools. So the athletic trainers get it. But some of these old school coaches will just say, don't be a wuss. You have to train today no matter what and do X, Y, Z, because by God, they're going to stick to that training program or stick to their practice. And we're basically saying like, look, that's a skeleton of what in a nice world would happen, but there's going to be changes. And we need to be flexible as well. So we're trying to educate them on how to train in season and how to manage it.
Yeah. I mean, the fact of the matter is in season, we have a tendency to, if your program is well written, you should be able to, at a minimum, maintain your power output.
Yep.
You should be able to. It doesn't always happen because, especially with sports that have a lot of matches and games, it's difficult to maintain that, because from an individual standpoint, maybe we have a soccer player who plays 90 minutes every single match.
Right.
But obvious issue with that is going to be fatigue management. And it's not to say that we can't maintain what they started at, but it's going to be more challenging. But the other thing is in-season lifting. You think about it from just a pure injury prevention standpoint. You're just making the athlete more durable, handle, and it's a long-term process. We've had, in the past with some sports, we've had injuries in season that, not to say that they could have been prevented, because you can't fully prevent injury.
Right.
You may be able to mitigate it a little bit by maintaining their strength over the course of the season, because we've had situations where we will test the team preseason and postseason with loads, and maybe at the beginning of the season there wasn't too much of a discrepancy from an unloaded movement and a loaded movement, but after the season's over, it's a massive difference.
Yep.
So essentially what that means is they lost all their strength. Not all, them being dramatic here, but a lot of strength. And then we go back and try to ask and figure out why.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't lift in season. That's the problem. When you have, those debilitating injuries, whether it's ACLs or anything like that, you start to question, is there more that we could have done?
Right.
So, and oftentimes, trust me, I'll raise my hand. I'm fully a stone guy here, but there are a lot of problems that can be solved just by getting stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel that way. Like we do for our assessment process, we do basically a modified FMS and then a few strength movements that are not 1RMs, because the last thing we want to do is bring a kid in who's never trained and say, well, max out,
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, I like to always tell my undergraduate students jokingly, but it's somewhat true. But if you get a freshman athlete to walk near a weight room, they'll probably get stronger.
Yeah.
They don't even have to walk inside. I mean, the biggest thing that we give freshman athletes and new athletes who've never really lifted before is we provide them with structure.
Yep.
Once they have structure, they're able to continue that exercise regimen, and then it becomes a long-term training process. They start to see benefits, then that's what we're trying to ingrain in them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because, going back to that just get stronger comment, I mean, that's so true. Because I tried my best to educate these athletes, because most of them that come in and work with us are spending money because they want to earn a scholarship, whether it's partial or full, to NAIA, D3, D2, D1 school. So unfortunately, they're not always guaranteed to have great strength coaches who know exactly what they're doing. So I feel like if we can basically educate them and teach them how to make decent decisions on their own. So I'll talk to them about, like, look, the body is basically like a pulley system that's arranged in X's on the front side and back side. Here's how you can bring about a little bit of balance, and your pain or discomfort will probably go away. Like, just give it a couple weeks.
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is pretty much we can prescribe anything to a newbie when it comes to training, and they can improve. But no, I mean, the structure and getting them stronger is the key. Once they, it's all about developing motor programs at first, and once they're able to do that, then we can load them properly. And then we can start to focus on power. The fact of the matter is all athletes have to be powerful.
Yep.
Just by getting stronger, you can get more powerful.
Right.
It's kind of amazing how that happens. Until someone gets really strong or stronger, then we can start to implement those strategies, those additional strategies to get that extra benefit from power. Or sorry, get that extra benefit from power.
Yeah. And I wrote a little blog. I keep a small blog on my personal website, and I just wrote the other day about, like, look, there's basically 3 things you need to do. It doesn't matter your goals, but basically you need to have pain-free range of motion. You need to get generally stronger, and you need to work on moving light objects really fast. Mm-hmm. And, like, for the lay person, if you do that, it doesn't matter the program you pick. It doesn't matter. Just pick something, stick to it, for God's sakes, for longer than 6 weeks, and work really hard. Like that's about it.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
Yeah. And have the intent to move everything, regardless of if it's light or heavy, as fast as possible.
Community, is there anything ineffective methods or principles that you would love to see just get killed and go by the wayside?
Well, the one thing that I feel that too many coaches they view the strength and conditioning world as black and white. Mm-hmm. And I mean that primarily just from a programming standpoint. Like we were talking about at the beginning of this, that there are many different ways to accomplish the exact same goal. Right. It's not you have to be an Olympic lifting person. You have to be a squatting person. You have to be a band person. No, you can use all these different methods at different times with different people. The fact of the matter is some people don't respond to certain types of training. So you have to find out something that works. What I tell my undergrad students is that there's no such thing as a cookie cutter program for any people. You know, if we take a baseball player and a volleyball player, if you actually go through and analyze their movements, they do a lot of the exact same things.
Mm-hmm.
Can you train them similarly? Yes. Would you train them identically? No.
Right.
Because they have unique movements that we have to end up training. You know, you don't have to block in baseball, but do you play overhead? Yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I think coaches try to make everything too black and white. The fact is the strength and conditioning world is an area of gray.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I always tell my new graduate students, like, welcome to the gray area. No, I'm serious, because it's, you know, you can come in with your philosophy and your base, but the fact that, you know, a lot of people are going to be doing the exact same thing, just slightly differently.
Yep.
You know, I have my philosophy of how I program. I like to think it's pretty ingrained in the science, but you also, the other thing I was going to say is you have to be open to change.
Yes.
You know, I think a lot of us would agree that weightlifting movements are beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people would debate that. But they say, well, you can't improve jump height with weightlifting. Some of the research says yes, some of the research says no.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to remember, it's not just about improving jump height. It's improving coordination of movements.
Yep.
Improving your ability to be strong in certain positions. So postural strength. You know, a lot of benefit, you know, if you're doing a catching variation or even a pulling variation, there's the eccentric stimulus that you get later. So it's not, I'm trying to improve jump height. That's my only reason. No, I'm trying to improve multiple qualities and trying to be efficient about doing it by using a single exercise rather than 4.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, but again, I know a lot of athletes who've been very successful and they've never done a clean or a snatch before.
Right.
You can do loaded jumps and accomplish a lot.
Yeah.
So, yeah, those are my biggest things. You know, I think we're getting to the point we're starting to turn the corner on the meathead mentality.
Yes.
It's always going to hang around. You know, anytime you hear the word strength and conditioning coach, usually think about, you know, someone who's bald, bearded, and I mean, you know, screaming at individuals to, you know, you have to go harder, you have to go faster, with spit flying out of their mouths and everything. So it's not that way though, because I've coached football players in terms of the weight room. I've coached volleyball players. I've coached divers. I mean, I can't coach them all the same. It's all about developing relationships with the athletes and figuring out what makes them tick and figuring out how to coach them. And it's even within a team itself. The volleyball team I work with now has 20 unique personalities.
Yep.
I cannot coach person A the same as I can coach person B.
Exactly.
The way it is. So I think getting outside of the mentality of, you know, everything is the same for everybody, because it's not.
Mm-hmm.
The gray area, but also being open to change and becoming educated. I applaud the coaches who have not only laid the foundation for us within this field, but also those who continue to learn despite being in the field for as long as they have.
Yeah.
You know, and so I would encourage anyone who would hear this, or anyone who is trying to just become more competent in the area, is never stop learning. Oh yeah, you can feel free to contact me. Both my Twitter and Instagram are at Dr. T Suchomel, and I have a link to, on my Twitter, I have a link to my ResearchGate page that has all of my research on there that I'm able to put up. And then on Instagram, not on that as much, but I try to keep up with that. You know, and anyone who contacts me, I try to get back to you pretty quickly. And, you know, I apologize if I don't, but I just know that eventually I will get back to you.
Yeah.